It started on a Sunday afternoon, the kind of day where the house seemed unusually quiet, yet the weight of unspoken tension lingered in the air. I had been sitting at the kitchen table, sorting through a folder of documents that I had carefully organized for months, each page representing another step toward the life I wanted for myself. College applications, budgets, plans for a small apartment I dreamed of moving into. My future had been neatly folded between those sheets. My father walked in with a serious expression, and without the courtesy of easing into the subject, he sat down across from me and cleared his throat in the way he always did when preparing to announce something final, something he expected no one to challenge. He told me, almost casually, that my brother was in trouble again. Debt. A lot of it. I didn't ask how much, because with him it was never a small figure. My father went on to explain that my brother had made mistakes, bad investments, loans he couldn't repay, and as always, he had managed to wrap himself in disaster. But this time, instead of his usual tone of disappointment, there was urgency in his voice, as though the responsibility to fix the mess had already been handed over to me. Then came the request, delivered not as a request at all, but as an expectation carved in stone. He wanted to use my savings to cover my brother's debt. For a moment, I sat there stunned, as though I hadn't heard correctly. My savings. The money I had worked late nights to earn, sacrificing weekends, selling things I cherished, saying no to outings my friends invited me to, putting away every penny for years with one clear purpose: to build a foundation for my independence. That money wasn't just numbers in an account. It was my escape route, my key to freedom, the tangible proof that my dreams weren't just figments of imagination. Yet, in a single sentence, my father reduced it to a bandage for my brother's reckless choices. I asked him, trying to keep my voice steady, why it always had to be me who gave up something, why my sacrifices were the currency used to patch up my brother's endless failures. He brushed it off with that tone that always made me feel small, as if questioning him was itself an offense. "Because he's family," he said, his eyes fixed on me as if those words alone should have been enough to silence me. He repeated the phrase that I had heard so many times before: family comes first. But the more he said it, the more it sounded hollow, because family in our house never meant all of us. It meant him and my brother, and me as the safety net. As he spoke, I realized he had already spoken to my brother, already promised him that everything would be fine, that I would help, as I always had, willingly or not. The decision had been made in my absence, as though my savings, my efforts, my life, belonged to them to distribute. I wasn't part of the conversation until it was time to deliver, and that was the moment when the weight of years fell on me. Every memory of putting money aside, every moment I told myself that one day it would all pay off, every sacrifice I made, it all came crashing against the realization that to my father, my dreams could be erased as easily as signing a check to cover someone else's disaster. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. Instead, I studied his face, the firm set of his jaw, the coldness of his stare, the way he was already preparing to call me ungrateful if I refused. He didn't see me as his daughter building a life. He saw me as an account, a solution, a lifeline for the son he never allowed to face the consequences of his actions. And in that moment, I understood something that had been true for years, but that I had never dared to admit. Love in our family wasn't evenly distributed. I was the dependable one, the one who could be squeezed dry, because he assumed I'd never break. That day, though, something inside me shifted. My father thought he was giving me no choice, that his voice alone still held the authority to dictate my life, but he underestimated the quiet rebellion that had been growing in me for years. I listened to him lay out his plan, how quickly the debt could be erased, how my brother just needed one more chance, how we couldn't let outsiders know of our family shame. The words spilled from him, as if the case was closed, but each sentence only built a fire in me that I couldn't extinguish. The unfairness of it all sat heavy on my chest, not only because of the request itself, but because of how normal it seemed to him. It was as if this cycle had repeated so many times that he no longer saw the cruelty in it. He thought he was teaching me loyalty, but what he was really demanding was submission. He was asking me to erase my own future to protect a brother who had never learned to protect himself. And for the first time, I saw clearly that saying yes would not only mean losing my money, it would mean losing myself. So I didn't answer him right away. I sat in silence, my mind spinning, my heart pounding. He looked at me as though waiting for a nod, a quiet surrender, the same one he had always counted on. But in that silence, I was writing a new beginning, one where I would no longer accept being the backup plan for someone else's mistakes. And even though he couldn't see it yet, the path of this family was about to change. I remember when I first began saving, back when the idea of independence was nothing more than a faint outline in my mind, a dream I wasn't even sure I was allowed to have. I was younger then, still naive enough to believe that if I kept my head down, studied hard, and worked more hours than my body wanted, eventually I would be rewarded with the life I wanted, not the life that was always chosen for me. I told no one at first, slipping coins and bills into an envelope hidden inside the drawer beneath my clothes. Later, when the amount grew beyond what I could keep in secret at home, I opened a savings account at the bank, proud of myself for having something of my own. I never told my family the exact number, never revealed the sacrifices it took to build it, because in my heart, I feared that one day they would see it not as my safety net, but as theirs. And looking back now, I realized that fear was never paranoia. It was foresight. The sacrifices weren't loud, and that was the cruelest part. They weren't moments anyone else could see or applaud, but small, relentless decisions that carved away at me in silence. Every Friday night when friends asked me to join them, I stayed behind and worked an extra shift at the diner. Every time my classmates came back from vacations with photos of beaches and mountains, I smiled politely, knowing my summers had been spent scrubbing floors or bagging groceries. Birthdays passed with gifts I bought for others but never for myself, because I told myself the bigger gift would come later, the life I was quietly funding brick by brick. My brother, on the other hand, never carried that kind of burden. He lived like there was no tomorrow, confident that someone else would pick up the pieces if tomorrow arrived with a bill he couldn't pay. And someone always did. My father would bail him out, or my mother would sell something valuable, or, when both of them grew tired, their eyes would inevitably turn toward me, the reliable daughter who didn't cause trouble, who always seemed to have enough. I could never forget the sting of those moments when my sacrifices were invisible. When my brother was praised for the smallest gesture, like showing up sober to a family dinner, my father would beam with pride, calling him a man who was finding his way. Yet when I came home exhausted from 12 hours of work and a full day of classes, there was only silence, as if my efforts were expected, unworthy of acknowledgement. My savings, the very thing I clung to as proof that I was worth something, were seen by them not as an achievement, but as a resource waiting to be tapped. And when my father sat across from me that Sunday, declaring that the money was needed to cover my brother's debts, it wasn't a sudden betrayal. It was the culmination of years in which my role had been defined, not as a daughter with her own future, but as the family's reserve. I remembered the nights I cried quietly in my room, staring at the ceiling, wondering if maybe I was wrong to want something different. Wasn't family supposed to come first? Had I misunderstood the meaning of sacrifice? I thought of the many times my father's words echoed through the house, those same words he used against me now. Family comes first. But when he said it, it never seemed to include me. Family was something I served, not something that served me. I was the tool, not the beneficiary. My brother's mistakes were forgiven in the name of family, but my dreams were dismissed in the same name. The weight of all those years pressed down on me as I looked at him across the table, explaining so calmly why I needed to let go of my plans, as if those years of sweat and exhaustion were nothing more than spare change to be redirected. He didn't see the countless shifts I had worked, the meals I had skipped to save a few extra dollars, the loneliness I carried when I couldn't afford to join my friends. He didn't want to see it. To him, my savings weren't attached to nights of aching feet, to hands raw from cleaning, to hours stolen from my youth. They were just numbers in a ledger, numbers that could be moved to fix his son's latest disaster. But I felt every ounce of those sacrifices sitting heavy in my chest, reminding me of who I was and what I had endured to get this far. And for the first time, instead of bending under that weight, I began to stand taller. If I let them take it now, then all those years would vanish into nothing, swallowed by the same cycle that had always consumed my brother's mistakes. I had carried the family on my back long enough, and now the burden had to stay with those who created it. My father thought he could shame me into submission with the word ungrateful, but gratitude and servitude were not the same. Gratitude did not mean erasing myself. As he waited for my response, the silence grew thicker, filled with the ghosts of all my past sacrifices. They whispered to me, urging me not to betray them by giving up what they had built. My hands trembled under the table, but my resolve grew stronger. The years of silent endurance had finally led me to this moment, a moment where I had the power to decide whether I would remain invisible or finally be seen. And though he didn't know it yet, my father had asked me for something he could no longer take, because I had already chosen who I wanted to protect, myself, and the life I was still determined to create. It is impossible to tell the story of that Sunday without unraveling the long thread that had been weaving itself through the fabric of my life since childhood. A thread dyed in favoritism and partiality, stitched by the hands of a father who never once tried to hide that his son was the center of his pride. From as early as I can remember, the house was divided by an invisible hierarchy, and though no one spoke of it openly, every glance, every tone, every decision confirmed what I already knew. My brother could do no wrong, and I could never do enough. When we were children, he was celebrated for the smallest efforts, bringing home a drawing from school, scoring a goal in a game he hadn't even taken seriously. My father would clap him on the back, call him a champion, and repeat the stories to relatives for weeks as though they were proof of greatness. Yet when I quietly brought home perfect grades, certificates, recognition for diligence, the most I received was a nod. Sometimes not even that. Achievement was expected of me, not celebrated. My worth was measured not by what I accomplished, but by what I could endure. The years went by, and the pattern deepened. My brother grew reckless, indulged in every impulse, cushioned by the knowledge that someone would always save him from the consequences. My father would scold him with a firm voice, but follow it with excuses, blaming bad luck, bad company, or anyone but him. Meanwhile, I grew into the role of responsibility, carrying duties far heavier than my age should have allowed. If chores weren't done, it was my fault. If money was tight, I had to find ways to stretch it. If my brother needed help with schoolwork, I was told to drop my own assignments to tutor him. And when he failed anyway, it wasn't his laziness that was questioned. It was whether I had truly done my best to help. Favoritism was not only in the rewards he received, but in the burdens I was expected to carry for him. There were birthdays where he was showered with gifts, bicycles, expensive shoes, video games, while I received something practical, useful, always framed as necessity rather than celebration. "You'll need this for school," my father would say, placing another set of pens or notebooks in front of me while my brother tore into wrapping paper and grinned at the luxury that waited inside. I learned early that joy was not for me, only utility. When I dared to question it, my father would look at me with disappointment, as if my envy was proof of ingratitude. He told me I should be proud to be the dependable one, the daughter he could count on. But that pride was hollow, because it was built on erasing myself so that my brother could shine. The favoritism bled into every corner of our lives, so subtle at times that I almost believed I was imagining it, until moments came that ripped the illusion apart. I remember one particular evening when my brother crashed my mother's car after drinking too much. Instead of grounding him, my father patted his shoulder and said, "Boys make mistakes. It's how they learn." Yet when I once forgot to return a library book, I was lectured for an hour about responsibility and how I needed to be more disciplined. The double standard was suffocating. I carried it silently for years, but each moment left a scar, small but permanent, until my entire sense of self was stitched with them. By the time that Sunday arrived, when my father sat at the table and demanded my savings, it wasn't only about money. It was about a lifetime of being second place in my own family, a lifetime of being told through actions, if not words, that I was less valuable than the brother who stumbled through life with open hands. That demand was simply the clearest proof yet that, in his eyes, my dreams could always be sacrificed for my brother's mistakes. And the cruelty of it all was how normal it seemed to him, how little thought it took to ask me to throw away years of work. He did not even flinch when he spoke the words. He assumed my compliance, because history had taught him that I would always fold under the weight of his authority. The favoritism wasn't just painful, it was corrosive. It seeped into my relationships with others, making me question whether my efforts would ever be enough, whether love was always conditional on being useful. I often wondered if my father even knew who I was beyond the role I played, if he had ever looked at me as a person with her own desires, or only as the shadow standing behind his son. My brother's failures never diminished his worth in my father's eyes, but my smallest refusals, my smallest attempts at independence, were treated as betrayal. That imbalance had shaped me more than I admitted, but on that Sunday, it finally hardened into clarity. As he sat there, defending my brother yet again, I realized that his favoritism was no longer just a family flaw. It was a chain he expected me to carry for the rest of my life. By asking for my savings, he wasn't only robbing me of money, he was demanding I accept the role of servant, forever sacrificing for a brother who would never learn. And for the first time, instead of quietly enduring, I felt a surge of defiance rise within me. Every instance of favoritism replayed in my mind, not as memories to swallow, but as evidence in a case I could no longer ignore. The pain of always being second had become the reason I needed to finally choose myself first. The air in the room grew heavier the longer I sat there without giving him the response he expected, and I could see the impatience building in my father's eyes, the way his jaw tightened as though my silence was more offensive than any refusal could ever be. He leaned forward, his hand flat on the table, the old authority dripping from every line of his body, and he demanded again, this time louder, that I stop being difficult and agree to help my brother. His voice cracked like a whip in the kitchen, echoing against the walls that had heard countless commands from him before, commands I had obeyed without question. But this time, something inside me refused to bend, and my hesitation ignited him like fuel on fire. He slammed his hand down and shouted, his words tearing through the room, "You're ungrateful." The accusation rang so sharply that for a moment I forgot to breathe, my body frozen in the chair as though struck by a physical blow. He had said many things to me over the years, dismissed my efforts, overlooked my achievements, but never before had he thrown that word at me with such venom, as if I were the betrayer in this story, the one who owed everything to the family yet gave nothing back. Ungrateful. The word stung because it twisted the truth into something ugly, because it erased years of sacrifice and painted me as selfish. In his mind, gratitude was not about love or respect. It was about obedience, about erasing my own needs to serve the demands of others. To him, refusing to give away my savings was not an act of self-preservation. It was proof that I had turned my back on the family. And as he stared at me with that mixture of disappointment and rage, I realized he truly believed it. The outburst was not just about money. It was about control, about the crumbling of a system where he had always dictated the rules. He had raised me to feel guilt whenever I chose myself, to believe that loyalty meant silence, that service was love. And when I broke that unspoken contract by even daring to hesitate, he lashed out with the one weapon he knew could wound me: shame. My brother sat there too, shifting in his chair, but saying nothing, his silence betraying the comfort of someone who knew the storm wasn't meant for him. He didn't need to defend himself, because my father was already doing it for him, turning the full weight of his fury on me. The more I thought about it, the more absurd it became. I was being called ungrateful for refusing to erase years of hard work, for daring to want a future that wasn't dictated by my brother's debts. Gratitude, in his mouth, had become a demand for sacrifice without end. And though the word hurt, though it cut deeper than I wanted to admit, I felt something strange underneath it, a quiet strength rising, a refusal to be defined by his version of the story. If being grateful meant destroying myself, then perhaps I was ready to be the opposite in his eyes. I didn't shout back. My father expected me to crumble, to beg forgiveness, to promise that of course he was right, and that I would do what was best for the family. Instead, I held his gaze, letting the silence after his outburst grow thick and uncomfortable. He mistook it at first for weakness, for the calm before surrender, But what he didn't realize was that I had finally stopped playing my role. I remembered every night I had stayed up working, every birthday where I received nothing but practicality, every time my brother's failures had been excused while my smallest mistakes had been punished. His shout didn't break me. It exposed the truth I had been too afraid to say aloud. I had been treated as less than all my life, and still expected to give more. The irony was almost unbearable. He accused me of ingratitude, while ignoring the endless gratitude I had shown in silence. Gratitude expressed in the hours I worked to ease the household's burden, in the sacrifices I made without complaint, in the loyalty I had demonstrated again and again, even when it cost me. My refusal was not ingratitude. It was survival. It was the line I should have drawn years ago, the line that said I mattered too. But to him, that line was rebellion, and he could not allow rebellion without punishment. His face reddened as he waited for me to fold, his voice still reverberating in the air, and I knew in that moment that we had crossed a threshold we could never return from. The shout was not just noise. It was a declaration of war against my independence, against my right to exist outside of his expectations. And though I felt the sting of tears threatening at the corners of my eyes, I refused to let them fall, because tears would only confirm what he wanted to believe, that I was still the child he could scold into obedience. Instead, I let the silence hang, long enough for him to realize that his authority no longer had the effect it once did. That night marked a shift in the balance of our family. His outburst revealed not my ingratitude, but his fear. Fear of losing control, fear that his words no longer shaped my destiny. The word he hurled at me was meant to cage me, but instead it broke the bars wide open, and as I sat there in the echo of his anger, I felt something new rise inside me. Not the familiar weight of guilt, but the first taste of freedom. The moment the word ungrateful left his mouth, it lingered in the air like smoke after a fire, clinging to everything it touched, heavy and suffocating. I sat across from him, his voice still vibrating through my chest, his eyes blazing with the certainty that he had cornered me into submission. For most of my life, I would have lowered my head then, let the shame seep into me until it swallowed every fragment of resistance. I would have apologized, maybe even believed I was in the wrong, because he had trained me to think that denying him was the same as betraying the family. But this time was different. I had carried too many years of sacrifices, endured too many instances of favoritism, and the weight of it all had built a wall inside me, one that his anger could no longer break down. When the silence became unbearable, I finally opened my mouth, not to beg, not to explain, but to deliver the words that had been forming quietly in my mind, sharper and stronger with each second that passed. He had shouted that family came first, as though it were a trump card that ended the conversation, as though those words alone were enough to make me hand over everything I had worked for. I could still hear the echo of it. Family comes first. He said it with the conviction of someone who believed he was teaching me a moral lesson. But to me, the phrase rang hollow, a weapon used to disguise the fact that his definition of family had always been selective. I thought of all the years when I had been overlooked, my achievements ignored, my sacrifices taken for granted, while my brother was forgiven for every failure. If family truly came first, then why had I always been last? So I looked him in the eyes, steady and unflinching, and I answered with a calmness that surprised even me. Exactly, I said, my voice low but firm, carrying more weight than shouting ever could. My future family. His brow furrowed, confusion flickering for a moment before anger surged again, but I didn't let him interrupt. I leaned forward slightly, closing the distance between us, and continued. I've been saving this money for years, not so that I could clean up someone else's mistakes, not so I could throw away my dreams to protect a brother who refuses to learn. I saved it for me, for the life I want to build, for the family I hope to create one day, a family where responsibility isn't twisted into punishment, where love isn't measured by how much you're willing to sacrifice of yourself. That's what I mean by family coming first. Mine. My future. Not yours, not his. The words came out colder than I expected, each syllable a blade honed by years of quiet resentment. They cut through the room, slicing into the fragile illusion that my father's authority still held absolute power. For the first time, I saw his face falter, the certainty in his eyes replaced by something else. Shock, disbelief, perhaps even the faintest trace of fear. He wasn't used to me speaking back, certainly not with this kind of finality. His anger had always worked before, the raised voice, the accusations, the guilt. But now, none of it could touch me. My reply was a wall he couldn't climb, a truth he couldn't twist. The silence that followed was thick, pressing down on everyone in the room. My mother's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. My brother shifted uncomfortably, his smirk gone, his eyes darting between me and our father as if waiting for someone to break the tension. But no one spoke. They all seemed to realize that something irreversible had just happened, that a line had been crossed and could never be redrawn. I felt a strange calm settle over me, the kind of calm that comes not from peace, but from certainty. I had spent so much of my life doubting myself, wondering if I was selfish for wanting more, if I was wrong for resenting the way things were. But in that moment, I knew I was right. I wasn't ungrateful. I wasn't selfish. I was finally standing up for myself, and for the future I had worked so hard to claim. The coldness in my voice wasn't cruelty. It was clarity, the kind that only comes when you've been pushed past every limit and finally refused to be pushed any further. My father opened his mouth as if to argue, but no sound came. Perhaps he realized that anything he said would sound weak against the finality of my words, or perhaps he simply couldn't comprehend that his daughter, the dependable one, the quiet one, had chosen herself over the family he had always prioritized. His silence was louder than any argument, and in that silence, I felt the shift, the balance of power tilting, the chains loosening from around my shoulders. I sat back in my chair, my eyes still on him, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I felt unshakable, as though the years of silence and sacrifice had led to this exact moment, a single reply that rewrote the story of who I was in this family. My future family, I repeated softly, not to him this time, but to myself, as a vow. The words tasted different on my tongue, not like defiance, but like freedom, a promise that I would no longer be bound by expectations that erased me. And as the room sat frozen, as the weight of my reply pressed into every corner, I realized that nothing would ever be the same again. The moment the words left my lips, calm, unshaken, and deliberate, the atmosphere in the room transformed into something that was no longer just tense, but almost suffocating. It was the kind of silence that carried a weight far heavier than any argument, a silence that forced everyone present to confront the truth they had been avoiding for years. My father, who had built his authority on shouting and dominance, suddenly seemed robbed of his usual arsenal. The word, ungrateful, still lingered between us, but it had lost its sting, disarmed by the way I had thrown it back at him without fear. For once he had no quick retort, no booming declaration to remind me of my place. Instead, he sat there, his hand still pressed against the table, his lips slightly parted as if searching for a reply, but no sound came. He wasn't used to losing control of a conversation, and it showed in the rare flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. My mother was the first to move, though barely. Her hand fidgeted with the hem of her apron, her eyes darting nervously between us, like a spectator at a play where the script had been suddenly thrown out. She looked as though she wanted to speak, to smooth over the edges of what had just been said, but something about the sharpness of my words had paralyzed her. She was used to being the quiet buffer in our household, the one who nodded along to my father's declarations, who whispered apologies to me later, but never challenged him in the moment. Now, though, even she seemed to understand that the silence demanded acknowledgement, that this wasn't something that could be swept under the rug with a sigh and a pat on the shoulder. My brother, slouched in his chair, had lost the easy arrogance that usually accompanied him like a second skin. He wasn't smirking anymore. His eyes were fixed on me with a mixture of shock and resentment, as if he couldn't quite believe that I, the sister who had always been the dependable fallback, had chosen this moment to sever the rope he had been dangling from. He had grown so accustomed to being rescued that the possibility of facing his own failures had never crossed his mind. And now, as the silence expanded, he shifted uncomfortably, his foot tapping against the floor, betraying his unease. For the first time, he realized the safety net wasn't there anymore. The silence itself seemed alive, stretching between us, amplifying every small sound: the hum of the refrigerator, the distant ticking of the clock on the wall, the faint rustle of my mother's hands. I could hear my own heartbeat, steady but heavy, as if each thud were hammering the final nails into the coffin of the life I had been expected to live. And still, I refused to look away from my father, holding his gaze with a calmness that I knew unnerved him. In the past, he had drawn power from my hesitation, from the way I would avert my eyes, from the way my voice faltered when I tried to stand up for myself. But this time, I gave him nothing. No fear, no retreat, no apology. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours, and the silence became unbearable for everyone else in the room. It pressed down like a weight none of them wanted to carry, because within it lay the undeniable truth that the family order had been disrupted, the dynamic that had governed our lives for years. My father as unquestioned authority, my brother as the favored son, me as the silent giver, had cracked open, and in the fracture, something new had taken shape. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was irreversible. At last, my father leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight, and exhaled sharply through his nose. His face was red, his jaw clenched, but his words didn't come. He wanted to reassert his dominance, to shout again, to crush my defiance with sheer volume, but the silence had already revealed too much. Any words he spoke now would sound hollow, desperate, and he knew it. His power had always rested on the belief that I would fold, but now that I hadn't, the foundation of his authority was shaken. I let the silence stretch longer, because it was no longer my enemy. It was my ally. It filled the room with the weight of my refusal, making it clear without me needing to repeat myself. Every second that ticked by was proof that I would not retract my words, that the decision I had made was final. For years, I had been silenced by fear and guilt, but now I was the one wielding silence, and I realized how powerful it could be. Finally, my mother whispered my name, so softly it was almost lost in the heavy air. There was a plea in her voice, not for me to reconsider, but for the storm to pass, for the fragile structure of our family to survive this moment intact. But even she seemed to know, deep down, that it wouldn't. Something had shifted permanently, and no matter how much she wanted to return to the way things were, we had crossed a threshold that could not be uncrossed. The silence that filled the room wasn't just the absence of words. It was the sound of an old order collapsing, the sound of decades of favoritism and sacrifice finally being confronted. It was the echo of every time I had swallowed my pain, now resonating back at them with undeniable force. And though it was heavy, though it was suffocating, it was also liberating. For the first time, the silence didn't make me feel small. It made me feel powerful. I sat in that silence, steady and unbroken, and I knew they all felt it too. The future would not look like the past, and I was no longer the person they thought I was. The morning after that confrontation, the silence from the kitchen still seemed to hang over me like a shadow, lingering in every corner of the house. A reminder that words once spoken could not be taken back, and that something fundamental had shifted forever. I barely slept that night, lying awake with my eyes fixed on the ceiling, listening to the creaks of the old house, as if it too were unsettled by what had occurred. My father hadn't said a word to me after his outburst, and my mother had retreated into quiet tasks, her face pale and tight with worry. My brother had left the table with a muttered curse under his breath, but he hadn't dared to confront me directly, perhaps too stunned that I had actually stood my ground. Yet beneath all of that, beneath the heavy silence and the exhaustion that clung to me like a second skin, there was something else, an unwavering clarity that refused to be shaken. The decision I had made wasn't complete until I acted on it, and I knew what I had to do. By the time the sun rose, pale light seeping through the curtains, I was already dressed and ready, a folder tucked beneath my arm holding every piece of documentation related to the account I had been building for years. Each statement, each receipt, each record of deposit felt heavier than paper. It felt like pieces of my life, tangible proof of all the nights I had worked when I should have been resting, all the weekends I had given up, all the dreams I had put into numbers that grew line by line. I walked through the house quietly, the floorboards groaning under my steps, but no one stopped me. My father remained in his room, perhaps brooding, perhaps waiting for me to come crawling back to apologize. He didn't realize that the opposite was about to happen. The bank was only a few blocks away, a familiar building of brick and glass that I had visited countless times before, though never with the sense of finality I carried now. As I pushed open the heavy doors, the cool air inside greeted me, and for the first time, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The clerks bustled about, the smell of ink and paper and faint perfume mixing in the air, and I approached the counter with steady steps. The woman behind the desk greeted me politely, her voice cheerful in a way that almost felt surreal against the storm that had raged in my home only hours before. "I'd like to close my account," I said simply, placing the folder on the counter. The words felt heavy, definitive, yet liberating. She looked up at me in surprise, perhaps noticing how young I was, perhaps curious as to why someone would end something they had worked so hard to build. But she asked no questions, only nodded, and began typing. As she did, I felt the enormity of what I was doing settle deeper into me. Closing the account wasn't about the money alone. It was about cutting off the pipeline that my father believed he controlled, the reservoir he assumed he could tap whenever my brother's recklessness demanded it. By shutting it down, I wasn't just protecting my savings. I was reclaiming my agency, making it clear in the most practical, undeniable way that my sacrifices were mine alone to decide what to do with. As the transaction progressed, I glanced around the bank, noticing the ordinary details I had ignored on so many previous visits. The posters advertising loans, the quiet hum of the printers, the polite exchanges between customers and clerks. It struck me how normal this place was, and yet how monumental this moment felt in my life. I signed the necessary forms, my hand steady, my name etched in ink like a declaration of independence. When the clerk asked if I wanted the balance transferred into a cashier's check or withdrawn, I chose the check, folding it neatly into my folder, the paper crisp against my fingertips. That piece of paper held the years of my labor, and for the first time, it felt secure because it was finally out of reach from those who had always taken me for granted. Walking out of the bank, I felt lighter, as though chains I hadn't realized I was carrying had finally fallen away. The morning air was brisk, the streets alive with people going about their lives, and I blended into the crowd with a strange sense of anonymity and freedom. No one around me knew the battle I had just fought, the war that had been raging within the walls of my home, but I carried the quiet victory with me like armor. Closing the account was more than a financial move. It was a declaration that my father's authority no longer dictated my future, that my brother's failures were no longer my burden to carry. When I returned home, the atmosphere was brittle, as though everyone was waiting to see what I would do next. My father looked at me from his chair, his eyes narrowing when he saw the folder in my hands, suspicion flickering across his face. I didn't offer him explanations. I didn't need to. The silence between us said enough, and when I walked past him without a word, I could feel his anger simmering beneath the surface, but also his helplessness. He could shout, he could call me names, but he couldn't undo what I had just done. For the first time, the power was no longer his. I went to my room, closed the door, and sat on the edge of my bed with the check resting in my lap. The paper seemed fragile, easy to tear, yet it represented something unbreakable. It was mine, my proof, my shield, my future. As I stared at it, I thought of all the times I had been told to put family first, all the times I had been made to feel guilty for wanting more. And now, holding that check, I realized I had finally put myself first, and the silence that followed was not heavy or suffocating this time. It was liberating, the sound of freedom settling into its rightful place. When I closed the account, I thought the silence that followed me home would remain unbroken, that my father would retreat into a brooding sulk, my mother into her nervous busyness, and my brother into the carelessness he always wore like a cloak. But silence, like still water, rarely stays calm for long when stones are thrown into it, and closing that account had been more than a stone. It had been a boulder crashing into the center of our family's fragile equilibrium. The chain reaction began quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the stiffness of my father's posture when he saw me walk past him with the folder held tight to my chest, his lips pressed together so firmly they seemed bloodless, his eyes narrowing with a fury that was still calculating, measuring its moment. My mother hovered behind him, her hands twisting in her apron as though she wanted to say something, to diffuse what she already sensed was about to ignite, but no words came. My brother was less restrained. That evening, as I sat at the desk in my room reviewing my notes, I heard the thunder of his footsteps down the hallway, heavy and uneven, and then his voice tore through the thin walls, sharp and furious. He accused me of betrayal, of ruining everything, of destroying not only his chance to start over, but also the fragile unity of the family. He slammed my door open without knocking, his face red, his eyes wild with a mixture of rage and panic. "Do you even understand what you've done?" He spat, his fists clenched at his sides. "I needed that money. Dad promised. You've left me with nothing." His words dripped with entitlement, as though my refusal to clean up his disaster was the greatest crime he had ever endured. I didn't rise from my chair. I didn't match his anger. Instead, I looked at him with the same calm I had given my father the day before, the calm that seemed to enrage them both, more than shouting ever could. "You left yourself with nothing," I said, my voice steady. "I didn't take anything from you. You gambled, you borrowed, you lied, and now you want me to pay the price. That's not mine to carry anymore." For a moment, he looked as though he might strike me, his body trembling with the urge, but then he turned abruptly and stormed out, muttering curses under his breath. The walls trembled as he slammed the door behind him, and I knew that the first ripple of the chain reaction had already spread. The next day, the storm came from my father. He didn't shout this time, not in the same explosive way as before. Instead, his anger was cold, deliberate. Each word dropped like a stone meant to bruise rather than burn. He told me I had shamed him, that I had turned my back on everything he had taught me, that my selfishness had cracked the foundation of the family. He used the word selfish as though it were poison, spitting it out with disgust, his voice low and dangerous, but I heard the tremor beneath it, the faint quiver that betrayed his loss of control. He had always relied on my compliance, on my quiet obedience, and now that it was gone, he didn't know how to restore it. My mother wept quietly in the kitchen, her hands trembling as she washed dishes that were already clean. She tried to speak to me once, her voice breaking as she begged me to reconsider, to at least give a little, to compromise for the sake of peace. But even she seemed to know it was too late, that the decision was irreversible. Her tears weren't just for my brother or my father. They were for the family dynamic that had defined her life, the structure she had learned to survive within. My refusal had not only broken my father's authority and my brother's safety net, it had cracked open her fragile illusion that if she kept quiet and compliant, things would always remain bearable. The chain reaction spread beyond our walls, too. Relatives called after my father told them his version of events, painting me as the ungrateful daughter who had abandoned her family in their time of need. I heard the whispers, the judgment dripping from their voices, but it didn't wound me the way he thought it would. Instead, each disapproving word only strengthened the resolve within me, because I knew the truth of what had really happened, and I knew how much I had already given without thanks, without recognition. Their opinions no longer held me captive. As the days passed, the household became a battlefield of quiet hostilities. My brother avoided me except for the occasional glare, his once boastful stride now replaced with a nervous twitchiness as the weight of his debts pressed down without rescue. My father's silence was worse than his shouting, heavy and condemning, each glance filled with unspoken accusations. My mother floated between us like a ghost, her presence more absence than comfort, her eyes always downcast. But within me, amidst the wreckage of their disapproval, a strange sense of strength began to grow. For the first time, the cycle had been broken. The safety net was gone. The scapegoat had refused her role, and now they were left to face the consequences of their own choices. The chain reaction was painful, yes, but it was necessary. Families built on imbalance rarely survive the first true confrontation, and ours was no exception. The silence, the glares, the whispers, they were the aftershocks of an earthquake long overdue, and though it hurt to stand in the middle of it, I knew that this destruction was also a kind of creation, clearing the way for something new, something that no longer demanded the erasure of who I was. I sat alone many nights during that time, the check from the bank tucked safely away, the weight of their anger pressing against me, and yet I felt lighter than I ever had, because the chain reaction, though violent and unforgiving, was proof that I had finally chosen myself, and no one could undo that. The first sign that the chain reaction had evolved into something irreversible came one late afternoon when the phone rang and my brother answered it, his voice sharp at first, then wavering, then dropping into a desperate whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but I recognized the tone, that fragile edge of panic I had heard before whenever his lies collapsed around him. He slammed the receiver down so hard it rattled the table, and when he turned, his eyes darted past me as though I were no longer just his sister, but a mirror reflecting the truth he couldn't bear to face. For days after that call, the house filled with his restlessness, doors opening and closing, footsteps pacing deep into the night, muttered arguments with himself when he thought no one was listening. Without my savings to fall back on, the reality of his situation had begun to sink in, and for the first time, he was being forced to carry the weight of his own choices. My father reacted as I expected, by blaming me for everything. When creditors began circling, when the whispers in the neighborhood turned sharper, when his carefully polished image of control started to crack, he pointed his fury not at the son who had caused the chaos, but at the daughter who had refused to erase it. At dinner one evening, he spat words across the table that dripped with venom, telling me I had ruined the family, that I had allowed shame to enter our home. He spoke of reputation as if it were more important than truth, of appearances as if they were more valuable than integrity. My mother sat silently, her hands trembling as she picked at her food, her eyes glistening with tears she refused to let fall. She knew the real shame had nothing to do with me, but she didn't have the strength to say it aloud. The consequences extended beyond the walls of our house. Relatives who had always sided with my father began calling with their questions, their thinly veiled judgments. They repeated the story he had told them, that I had turned my back on family, that I had abandoned my brother in his time of need. But even among the lectures and the sighs of disappointment, I heard something else, subtle yet undeniable. Some of them were beginning to wonder why it was always me who was expected to save him, why my father had so easily promised away something that wasn't his to give. Their voices dropped lower when they asked those questions, as if afraid to admit their doubts, but I heard them nonetheless, and those faint cracks in the wall of disapproval gave me strength. Meanwhile, my brother's life began to unravel in ways that no one could hide. The creditors who had once been faceless names on letters were now men knocking at the door, their voices firm, their demands louder. He tried at first to charm them, then to threaten, but nothing worked. I watched him grow smaller each day, his shoulders hunched, his arrogance stripped away, his laughter gone. There was no safety net anymore, no quiet transfer from my account to bail him out, no whispered reassurance from my father that everything would be handled. For the first time, he was alone in the mess he had created, and though it pained me to see the fear in his eyes, it was also necessary. Without consequences, he would never change, and I refused to be the one who shielded him from learning the lessons life had been trying to teach him all along. My father's pride was perhaps the hardest consequence of all. He had built his entire identity on being the unshakable pillar of authority, the man who could command obedience and maintain order. But my refusal had shattered that illusion. The community he valued so deeply began to whisper, not only about my brother's debts, but about my father's inability to control his own household. I could see the bitterness gnawing at him, the way his shoulders slumped when he thought no one was looking, the way his eyes hardened whenever they landed on me. In his mind, I wasn't just his daughter anymore. I was the traitor who had exposed his weakness. And yet, amidst the chaos, I began to feel lighter. Each consequence that fell upon them confirmed what I had always known, but had been too afraid to say. Their actions, not mine, had brought us here. My brother's recklessness, my father's favoritism, my mother's silence, those were the seeds that had grown into this storm. I had been the soil they used for too long, absorbing all the damage, feeding their illusions. By refusing to sacrifice myself any longer, I had forced the storm to reveal itself, and though it was harsh, it was honest. The nights were still difficult. I would lie awake sometimes, listening to the muffled arguments in the next room, the sharp exchanges between my father and my brother, the quiet sobs of my mother when she thought no one could hear. The weight of their anger pressed against me, and there were moments when doubt crept in, whispering that perhaps it would have been easier to give in, to hand over the money and preserve the fragile peace. But then I would think of all the years I had already lost to silence, of all the dreams I had already postponed, of the way my father's voice had cracked with fury when he called me ungrateful. I would hold the memory of that check in my hands, its paper thin but its meaning unbreakable, and I would remind myself that peace built on my erasure was not peace at all. It was bondage. The real consequences weren't just theirs. They were mine too. I had lost whatever fragile affection remained between us, had severed ties that might never be repaired, had chosen a path that set me apart from the family that had shaped me. But in that loss, there was also gain. I gained a sense of self I had never known, a strength that came not from obedience but from defiance. And though the road ahead was uncertain, though the fractures in my family might never heal, I knew one thing with unshakable clarity. I had chosen myself, and no consequence could make me regret that. In the weeks that followed, the label my father had hurled at me, ungrateful, clung to me like a shadow. It echoed in the corners of the house, whispered in the calls from relatives, muttered under my brother's breath whenever he passed me in the hallway. At first, it weighed heavily, pressing against my chest, trying to convince me that perhaps I had indeed betrayed something sacred. But the more I carried it, the more I realized how the word began to change shape, how it lost its venom and turned into something else entirely. What they called ingratitude, I began to see as liberation. What they condemned as selfishness, I recognized as survival. With each passing day, the shame they tried to plant in me withered, and in its place, a new kind of strength grew, quiet, firm, unyielding. Life inside the house was no longer the same. My father, though he still walked with the heavy authority of a man clinging to control, had lost the effortless dominance he once held over me. His eyes no longer commanded obedience. Instead, they searched for cracks in my resolve and found none. My brother grew restless, thinner, his arrogance hollowed out by the gnawing bite of consequences he had never before been forced to face. He avoided me now, not because he had forgiven me, but because looking at me reminded him of the truth he couldn't escape, that his safety net was gone, and he was left with nothing but the debts of his own making. My mother moved like a ghost through the rooms, her silence louder than any words she might have spoken. Her eyes always turned downward, as though if she didn't look at me, she could pretend I hadn't defied the order that had defined her entire life. But within me, amidst the wreckage of their resentment, something new was being born. It wasn't dramatic or loud, not the kind of rebirth that announces itself with fanfare. It was quieter, deeper, like the slow unfolding of a flower that no one notices until it has fully bloomed. I felt it in the way I walked, lighter, more certain. I felt it in the way I planned my days, no longer building them around what others needed from me, but around the future I wanted for myself. The check from the bank, tucked safely away, became more than paper. It became a symbol, a reminder of the boundary I had drawn, the moment I had chosen to step out of the role they had written for me. I began to imagine the life ahead with a clarity I had never allowed myself before. The small apartment I could afford, where every corner would be mine, untouched by demands that drained me. The studies I could pursue, the career I could shape with my own hands, not as a daughter trying to prove her worth, but as a woman claiming her place in the world. I thought of the family I might one day create, not bound by manipulation or guilt, but by love, respect, and fairness. For so long, family comes first had been used as a weapon against me, a phrase that demanded my silence and sacrifice. But now I reclaimed it, reshaping it into a vow for the future. My family, my choice, my rules. The community continued to whisper, their stories carried on the wind like gossip always is, but I stopped hearing judgment in their voices. Instead, I heard distance, the kind that comes when people don't know how to understand someone who has broken free. And I realized I didn't need their approval any more than I needed my father's. The only voice I needed to trust was my own, and for the first time, it was steady and clear, no longer drowned out by guilt or fear. Sometimes, Late at night, I would sit by the window, the moonlight spilling across my desk, and I would think back on the girl I had been, the girl who stayed silent, who worked herself raw, who believed that if she gave enough, she might finally be seen. I felt a pang of grief for her, for all the years she had lost, for all the times she swallowed her own dreams so others could live theirs. But I also felt pride, because she had survived long enough to give birth to someone new, the woman who refused to be erased. The word ungrateful no longer stung. It no longer felt like an insult hurled to diminish me. Instead, it became a title I wore with quiet defiance, a reminder that I had dared to break free from the cycle that would have consumed me. If gratitude meant erasing myself for their comfort, then I was glad to be ungrateful. If loyalty meant sacrificing my future for my brother's failures, then I embraced disloyalty, because in truth, I had never been ungrateful. I had simply been unseen. And now, finally, I refused to be invisible. So the rebirth of the ungrateful daughter wasn't a single moment, but a series of choices, each one carrying me further from the cage I had lived in and closer to the life I wanted. It was in the silence I wielded like a weapon, in the check I carried like a shield, in the calmness of my voice when I said, "Exactly, my future family." It was in every step I took toward independence, every breath I took free of guilt, every dream I allowed myself to nurture without apology. And though my father's eyes still burned with disappointment, my brother's voice still dripped with resentment, and my mother's silence still echoed with sorrow, I knew that none of it defined me anymore. I had been reborn in the crucible of their anger, and I emerged not broken, but stronger, sharper, freer. I was no longer the daughter they thought they owned. I was no longer the sister who existed to save. I was no longer the shadow of a family that only valued me for what I could give. I was myself, ungrateful and unashamed, and for the first time in my life, that was enough.